All right, gents, so let's take a look at policy discovery and management. Let's actually try to understand how Tetration is going to take all this data that we've given it and automatically generate a policy for us. So keep in mind that at this point, we've learned everything we can about your individual workloads, right? We've collected all their flow data, all their processes, all their vulnerabilities. I mean, we have collected a mountain of data. Now we can begin to actually automatically generate, and this is a big thing that I want to point out to you, we can begin to automatically generate what a segmentation policy would look like. But this is going to be based on your application behavior. It's not just going to be based on, okay, give me open ports and give me those flows. We are looking at every single running process, right? So this is going to be based on that software process that's running. This is going to be based on what's the actual behavior of that server, what are the flows of that server, plus what the workload context is. That means, you know, your third-party systems. This means your load balancers, your DNS, your CMDB. And this is really important because we're not using one or the other. We're actually combining this data all together. We can also, again, take in your workload information, not your workload, your workforce information. So if you have something like ICE or AnyConnect, right, we can then start to generate policies based on the data that we're seeing from these campus level systems. So what are the security group tags that these users are logging in or being given when they log in and they hit ICE? Or from AnyConnect NVM. By the way, sorry if I'm writing on an angle. I'm left-handed, so it kind of droops down. So what about from AnyConnect NVM? What if we want from either one of these systems or both systems, what if we want the LDAP group that these users are a member of? What if we want the user ID? So we'll just say UID. What if we want the local process of what we're seeing? So for example, if I want, this was JP, who's a member of HR, so JP, he's in human resources, and the process he's using is Internet Explorer, right? And he's using that in order to access this human resources web server, right? Maybe I want to put that into a policy. Maybe I want to say allow any time an LDAP user is in HR and only allow them when they're using local processes like Internet Explorer or something like that, or only allow them access to the application if they have the right version of antivirus running or something like that, right? So there's a lot that we can do here and a lot that Tetration can help us to automatically generate. Now, the first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to start by putting your applications into what we would call an application scope. Now, this scope is really just a bucket. Okay, it's a bucket of attributes, it's a bucket of labels that we're grabbing from all of your different systems, not just what we're learning, but also the things that we're integrating with. So, for example, in this case, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with maybe your application name, or maybe we'll say your company name here. So Acme, right? Cisco loves to use Acme a lot. So we're going to start with the company name. And then what we're going to do is anything that matches your RFC 1918 space, maybe we put that into a group called internal. Now, this is not necessarily how we would build out your environment. This is just an example of what we might do. So we would say, look, anytime it's 1918 address space, we're going to consider that internal. And anytime we have an integration with CMDB, like a ServiceNow or something like that, and the business unit equals finance, we're going to put any of those IP addresses or any of those servers into a separate bucket called finance. So we're actually starting to build out your application tree, your application structure. Okay, anytime within your CMDB or within maybe the VLAN information, or who knows, right? I'm just making it up, right? And maybe this comes from vCenter. Okay, maybe this tag is in vCenter where you have an application name. We're going to go ahead and we're going to put anything that equals banking into the banking group. And then what we're going to do is we're going to rely based on host name. Anytime the host name equals production, we want to put it in prod banking. And so what Tetration is going to do is it's going to start to build out this application scope. It's taking all of your prod servers, all of your banking servers, all of your finance servers, and it is putting them into a bucket. It's grouping them together based on the attributes that we're collecting, based on the things that we're actually collecting from other resources. And this is kind of what that looks like. So here would be your application scope down here where Tetration says, okay, I'm going to group all of these servers together. So remember, in here we have our internal servers, right? And then we have our finance servers, and then we have our banking servers. We'll just put B for banking. I'm too lazy. And then we have prod, right? So we have all these different servers in this group of application scopes. But the thing is that we want to get to a way that we can naturally group these servers together in a way that makes sense, right? What do I mean by natural grouping? Well, think about your applications today, right? Think about how your applications operate. Do you really know what they're made up of? right? I mean, if you think about it, to this point, we've thrown an obnoxious amount of data at this thing, right? Now we have a real opportunity to actually learn what these financial banking servers are actually doing within our application. And this is where Tetration's machine learning really comes in to help us out. As we noted in the beginning of this section, Tetration now combines your system of record along with the traffic flows and the software and begins to logically group things together based on application behavior. So, for example, database servers are going to begin to be put into a similar group, assuming that your database servers are acting the same way. So when Tetration sees, by the way, this is running MySQL. So when Tetration says, okay, I see all of these servers, they're all running MySQL. They all have inbound 3306 traffic from this application tier. These 4 servers are acting exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put them into a group on our own. So this is where we can finally start to understand, hey, how does this application actually act? The same thing will go with web servers. So as we see inbound traffic to these 2 servers on 443, and maybe this is running Apache, Tetration can go ahead and put all of these things into a group on its own. So again, it's now beginning to group things based on behavior, right? This is one of our biggest struggles. 90% of our customers know that, okay, these servers are production or they're dev or they're on that VLAN, right? They know where things are located. Typically, you know that your server is in Dallas or it's in data center 1, but most of us have no idea what the actual server or workload does within the application. We know that it's a database server, but maybe how is it used, right? When is it used? What does that traffic look like? Are all database servers clustered together? Maybe you have one of these database servers that is very different when it comes to behavior than the other 3 database servers. Maybe this one database server is actually shared with other applications where the other 3 are not. So Tetration can start to put together this map for us and show us how these different things are being utilized within our environment. And then don't forget your shared resources, right? Because you're going to have, again, possibly a shared database. You're going to have Active Directory that's going to be being used, right? You're going to have all these different things within your environment. And what's interesting is that Tetration can also manage these policies for us. What do I mean by manage these policies for us? Well, imagine that this is a shared resource within your environment. Everybody is using DNS, everybody's using NTP, Active Directory, your management tools like backup and jump boxes and things like that, right? Let's just say that this is app 123 and we are now building out this policy. Let's say that this is already built. So we've already gone in and we've already defined what our shared resources are. And app 123, we're in the process of mapping it out and generating what those policies should look like. If we already have policies here and these guys are coming online, Tetration is smart enough to see now these inbound and outbound connections and let you know, hey, I have all of these policies that need to be added to this already generated policy for this new application 123. Do you want me to go ahead and do that? You could say, yes, Tetration will go ahead and modify this policy to make this actually usable. And this is where the policy management comes in, right? So it's not just discovery, it's discovery and management. When we put all of these different policies within Tetration, Tetration is smart enough to actually say, okay, I see changes. I see where changes are required. Do you want me to go ahead and do that? And when I do that, Tetration can make the changes for me. This alleviates that management burden today where we may have 200 different firewalls and we don't know what change is going to affect what firewall or what's going to break. Tetration can now manage this for us. Finally, Tetration takes that map, takes how everything works and actually generates that policy, right? So if you think about all the things we're talking about, it's much too complicated for us human beings to look at all of that data in one giant spreadsheet or 5 different products and map it all out by ourselves. Tetration builds the segmentation policy for us. So it not only maps it out, it builds the policy for us. These policies can now, again, be centrally managed in one place. Tetration can manage all of those policy changes, and this allows us to truly automate and easily manage all the things that need to take place in our environment. So let's pause the video here. Let's jump into the lab and let's actually watch this happen. Okay, so we've already gone in and installed the agents. If you're following along in this little mini series we have, you already went through the installation process, so I don't need to show you that. I'm going to go in and I'm going to start building out. By the way, we've already built out an application scope for open cart. So we've gone in already. If I come over here to scopes, we've already built an open cart scope. So we've said, look, anytime the application stage within our CMDB equals production, we want to call it open cart. Very, very simple tag, very, very simple label, no big deal. So I'm going to come over here to my left-hand menu, and I'm going to click on applications. Now, you'll notice that I don't have any workspace created. A workspace is where we're going to generate our policy, where we're actually going to tell Tetration, look, I want you to examine the behavior of these servers, and I want you to generate what a policy would actually look like. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say create a new application workspace. Now, I got to give it a name, right? I mean, as anything you create, you got to give it a name. You got to give it something. It's just not going to automatically populate. Although, if I were to just say create here, you'll notice here that the default name would be pod 01 open cart. We have multiple different pods within this particular cluster, and so Tetration would auto-generate the name. I don't want to do that though, so I'm going to say open cart, and I'll make sure that the scope I'm looking at is open cart, and I'm going to say create. Again, very, very simple. Now I have two options. I can either select to automatically create policies or manually. Now in this case, I'm going to create them automatically, and while that runs, I'll go ahead and pivot over to some manually created policies that that I've created on a separate space. So I'm going to say automatically generate policies. This is where Tetration is going to bring me to a place where I can select how far back I want to go. So I can come over here to this date range selector. I can say max a month. I can, pick 1 week, 1 day, 6 hours. I can go back a custom date range, so I can go back a bit more if I want to. I can select specific times, or I can actually click this slider to go back as far as I want. So in this case, I'm just going to look at July 24th at 10 p.m. to July 26th at 12 p.m. You can also move this to a different period of time. So maybe I want to do, we'll go right here. We'll go from July 4th to the 7th, right? So I can select, again, custom ranges of time that I want to go back and look at. Now, in my case here, I have 5 servers that we're going to be dealing with. I have my workstation, I have my 2 web servers, I have my load balancer, and I have my database. So these are the different machines that essentially I'm going to go ahead and look for and try to figure out, okay, can you map out my particular application for me? Now, as I scroll down here, there's going to be different things that I want to do. First of all, Tetration has the ability to integrate with a load balancer. You can do this in many different ways. Again, you can either automatically configure your load balancer and Tetration together, integrate out of the box, or you can manually upload your load balancer configuration, if that's really what you want to do. So I'm going to go here to my load balancer configuration. I'm going to say open, and we're going to say, because this is a lab that we run quite frequently, I'm going to go ahead and say new. We'll give this guy a minute to upload. Here it is here, so we'll give it a minute to upload. This is where, again, we want Tetration to figure out, okay, how are these, how's the VIP working, or how is this going through my particular environment? We want to figure all that stuff out. So I'm going to go ahead, this should be done, and I'm going to say new. Now, last thing that I want to point out are these sliders here at the bottom. These sliders are going to be what we use to determine how we're going to group things together. So in this case here, the port generalization is going to be aggressive, meaning I want a policy that is a little bit more granular than just giving me port ranges, right? I can also tell Tetration to compress the policy if I want to. If I have 1,000 different policies, maybe I want Tetration to compress that a bit. And then the cluster granularity. This is, again, where Tetration is going to automatically cluster workloads together. It's going to automatically figure out that behavior, how these things are working, and it's going to go ahead, I want to make sure I pick the right load balancer config, and is automatically going to cluster these servers together. So in theory, if we see 2 web servers that are identical, they have the same software, the same flows, etc., the same processes, we should see these web servers come back to us in a group. Once I've selected my options, all I'm going to do is say submit ADM run. Now you'll notice up here I have a status window. This is going to take a couple minutes to run, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, jump over to another cluster, and show you some of the manual policies that I've done while this runs. So while our automatic policy gets generated, I'm going to come over here to what I call my global infosec policies. You can see that I have a number of different workspaces created here. This is what's really neat about Tetration. I can go in and I can create what we call a global infosec policy, and this policy is something that allows me to create some high-level rules for my environment. Now you'll see here that I have 8 different rules, and this is really cool. So I've created a rule here that says production is allowed to talk to production. Now, in my case, remember that Tetration is built on a whitelist model. So in my case, all of my allow statements are here, and then my catch-all is deny. Now in this case here, I'm looking for anything that's considered production. So if in my CMDB, my environment has been considered production, it's allowed to talk. What about P2? So in my case here, if P2 equals true, then it's allowed to talk to P2, but we've not allowed anything that is not P2 to talk to each other. Then I have my data center connections. So I have my my management tools, my Guacamole, my Ansible tower, they are allowed to see everything within my data center. So this is based on my RFC space. So if anything fits within my internal subnet ranges, they're allowed to talk, right? If it, again, is considered my management tools, like if my service scope is Guacamole. What about authenticated users? What about if I want to configure ICE to connect into Tetration and say, look, as long as they've authenticated and we've dropped them into a security group called employee, then they are allowed to access the data center, right? So only authenticated employees will be accessing the data center. And then think about IoT. Think about the ability to, again, connect ICE or any connect into Tetration and say, if the security group is IoT or if that device is MDM compliant, and as long as it's not jailbroken, we will allow it to connect into the data center. So I've created some of these high-level policies. I've done this across my entire data center. This is global, and this is one of the things I really want to point out to you folks is that these types of policies can be global across the data center, and I don't have to worry about managing 200 firewalls and where I'm going to push those ACLs. I can make this policy in Tetration. I can go ahead and hit enforce, and then Tetration can take care of this for me. So let's pivot back over to our other cluster where I think our automated policy is now complete. All right. So here's the moment of truth here. This policy is complete, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to see what we're actually able to glean. So I'm going to come over here and say results available, and we have 4 clusters. What's interesting is that over here you'll see that Tetration put the database server, where we only have 1, into its own cluster, the load balancer into its own cluster, the workstation into its own cluster. But notice here. Notice these web servers. If I click this, notice that we have Web 1 and Web 2 in their own cluster. We can look further into this by clicking on clusters, and Tetration gives us a very, very important piece of information. It gives us what we call the confidence score. So what Tetration is telling us is, look, based on the information that we've gleaned, based on the information we've gathered, we believe, and it's very high, our confidence is very high, that these 2 web servers are identical and they belong in a cluster. One of the things that I want to point out here that's really interesting is we can come over here to what we call edit cluster query, and Tetration will go ahead and examine those IP addresses, examine those workloads, and say, look, even though we're doing this based on IP address, there's a number of different dynamic queries that you can add. So based on the CMDB labels, based on DNS, based on vCenter, based on, all these different labels, based on ICE, AnyConnect, based on all this information that we're pumping in here, we think you could add a couple of dynamic queries. So rather than it being based on IP address, you can say, okay, if the role contains a web server, maybe we can do and host name contains, and we'll say web server. So now what we're going to do is we're going to tell Tetration, look, if the role of that server contains web server hyphen, or the host name, the role contains or the host name contains, then I want it to be put into this group. What this allows Tetration to do is now dynamically add or remove hosts based on that label. So it's no longer married to just simple IP address, right? So when your development team comes and adds a new web server to this particular application, it's not like we have to go and reinvent the wheel. as that new application server, as that new web server comes online, as long as we have the proper labels and as long as we've gone through our proper build process, that the minute that agent is installed and we've gone ahead and synchronized our CMDB or vCenter or whatever with Tetration, that machine will automatically be added to this group, will automatically get the policies that we've generated, which you can see here is approximately 31 different policies. So let's click on that. So here Tetration is generated 31 policies that this particular application needs to function. Now, here's where somebody usually stops me and says, okay, is this normal, right? How do I know if this is good or not? I'm going to come and click this button right here to say ungroup policies, and you'll notice here that Tetration has a confidence score with each individual policy. And you'll notice that some of these are moderate. In other words, I'm seeing that the workstation is pinging other machines within my pod, and that's a moderate confidence score. I don't know if that's something we really want to allow. Same thing with UDP 137 and 138. I'm not sure if that's something we want to allow. We can go ahead and we can use flow search. We can use conversation analysis to start breaking this down. So you'll see here where I can say view conversations. I can go and see all of that traffic, see the processes, see the roles, see all of the kind of things that are happening on that port using that protocol, and make a determination, is that something I need to allow? So Tetration is giving us a confidence score based on each port that it's opening, based on each service that it's going to allow, right? Which I think is really, really cool, because you definitely don't want to run a policy just based on source destination protocol and then essentially have no idea whether that traffic is good or not, right? So let's go and let's examine one of these conversations. Let's take a look at the load balancer. Let's look at the load balancer going to the web server, right? So we can see here that from the load balancer to the web server, we actually see the front end address and the back end port. So we see that the front end VIP here is 198.19.196.3, right? So we see that that IP address is what the front end is. Let's go ahead and say view conversations. Let's examine some of this stuff, right? So the conversation tab that shows up is actually a list of how the different clusters are providing and consuming different services over that particular port. And we can search for different things as well. So I can come in over here. I can say, you know what? I'm going to search for, let's say HTTP. And let's say, we'll say D, and I'm going to look at maybe just the process, right? So again, it's much more than just having the process or much more than just having the source destination port. I want to look at the individual process itself. So why do we need this open? Well, why do we have port 80 open? Can I verify that in fact this process is running? And yes, and not only do I see on that web server every single process, so not only do I see that NTP is open, look at what we're seeing. So I see that I have traffic here on port 80, so TCP port 80. I can see that it's because I can see that we have Apache running and root was the one that started that process. But again, as I was pointing out before, a lot of times we see NTP running. If you take a look, you'll notice that these ports are actually grayed out. That's because Tetration sees that I have NTP running. It sees port 123 open, but it sees absolutely no traffic on this particular port. Now we can make a logical decision. Do we want to shut that off? Is that something that we want to go ahead and either disable the service or disable the port? How do we want to do that? So all of this examination is possible once I've run the policy. I can really take a deep dive into why are we going to add these things? Does it make sense to add these things, or do we want to shut those ports down? I see SSH here, which is good, right? I shouldn't see Telnet, but suppose I did see Telnet and I saw Telnet traffic but no SSH traffic. I would know that my admins are still using Telnet and not SSH. I could go and slap them on the hand because of that, because now I see that we're actually seeing no traffic on that. Okay, so this is where we can really use Tetration's policy analysis. We can really dive into why we're going to go ahead and activate these rules, right? But the last thing I want to do is actually want to map out this application. I want to see how it's actually acting. So I'm going to go over here to the App View tab. I'm just going to say App View, and I'm going to say Create. Now, all I need to do is I need to pin one of these things into my map. Tetration does not overwhelm us with an application map. Tetration lets us to allows us to build it based on what things we want to see. You may not want to see every single server in your environment communicating, because that could very quickly become overwhelming. Let me just zoom in here a little bit so that we can see what we're doing. I'll zoom in just one more. There we go. So again, remember that Tetration just doesn't want to show us everything because it realizes that we may quickly become overwhelmed. But I want to see again how this application is interacting. So in my case here, I may have a misconfigured load balancer, or maybe I don't. right? Let's see how this acts. Let's actually map this out. All I need to do is I need to double click on these bubbles to see how this application acts. So I have a pod of servers. If I click on the pod, you'll see here that there's 392 workstations, machines within this pod. All these green bubbles here are the load balancers, so I can actually see that my workstation is going through a load balancer in order to get to the web server. I do have an agent. This is a software load balancer, so it's actually a Linux server. It's an HA proxy box. So I do have an agent living there, which is why this looks this way. But these green bubbles here are where the load balancers actually exist and actually are sharing that traffic. So my workstation goes to my load balancer, from my load balancer goes to the web server, and again, here are the two servers that are within that tier, and then off to the database server. So within one process, right, Tetration has been able to cluster my servers together using behavioral analysis, using the process flows, using all that information. It's been able to automatically generate out 31 different policies for me that say, hey, here are my confidence score. Here's the different policies I think we need to add in order for this application to actually continue to work. And here's a very simple map on how this application works throughout a daily basis. So this is something that very quickly and very easily we can gain when deploying Tetration. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys in the next one.